Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Why ExWorks Gets You Into Trouble. ExWorks is much misused, I'm afraid, internationally, and it is used by exporters generally to try and ensure, they believe, that they have as little liability and as little work to do in the international supply chain as they can possibly achieve. Now, that's either because they don't know how to do international shipments very well, they've not much practice at it, or because they simply want to limit their liability. Now, ExWorks is an Incoterm. Incoterms are there to prevent confusion and to prevent ambiguity in the international supply chain, because so many people are involved in an international supply chain, from the exporter to a transport company, to an airline, a shipping line, loaders, unloaders, there's so many different parties involved. It's really important to know who is responsible for doing what, who's responsible for telling somebody to do what, and who's paying the cost, and who's taking the risk. Now, that is what an Incoterm is for, to give clarity on who is responsible for what part of the supply chain, who is taking the cost of which parts of the supply chain, and who is bearing the insurable risk for which parts of the supply chain. So we must use our Incoterms with care. They are legally binding. They're not just a few letters you throw at a contract, they actually have legal meaning. They're published by the International Chamber of Commerce, and they're revised every 10 years. We're currently working to Incoterms 2020. And there are actually 11 terms, but ExWorks is the first term on the list. And most people think it gives minimal liability to the exporter, whoever they may be, wherever they may be. But actually, I'm afraid in most cases, it gives maximum liability to the exporter and the worst risk possible, because the exporter is completely blind to the risk. And this is why we get into such terrible trouble. Now, it's really because people don't actually understand what ExWorks means. And I know that's silly because it's obvious, isn't it? It means X your factory or office or your place, wherever that is. Surely that just means that you're responsible up to that point, and after that, it's goodbye. Nothing to do with you. If only that were true. ExWorks actually is supposed to mean a whole list of legal liabilities describing risk, cost, and responsibility throughout the supply chain, right the way to destination. And that is all behind the shorthand that we put in the contract, because ExWorks is simply shorthand for pages of legal liability. It stops you having to put those pages in your contract, which is a great thing. It also standardizes those words, which is another great thing, because that should remove ambiguity and the odd slip of the pen, which none of us really want to be responsible for, but often happens when you write an international contract. So why do we have a problem? Well, the first thing is, next to every Incoterm, there should be a named place. It's no good just to say ExWorks. ExWorks where? Is that ExWorks someplace in London, someplace in Essex, or someplace in Glasgow? Could be someplace in Birmingham, America, perhaps. Alabama, not UK. We don't know unless you put the place down. And the first mistake people make is not to put a place down. Many times because their systems that they use, particularly companies using large ERP systems, don't have a place for it. Someone's told them that you can use 3 digits to represent an Incoterm, which is true, because ExWorks can be put down simply as EXW, and they think that's it. So they give you a field for 3 digits, and they proudly print that on all the documentation for the contract and the invoices and everything else, and they think the job is done. ExWorks expressed like that is completely meaningless. Nobody knows what it means. You have just introduced complete ambiguity into your contract. which is the opposite of the intention. So if you're so sad to have a system like that, either you need to get an extra field added for the named place or find some comments field where you can put it in. But either way, it must appear on the documentation. Otherwise, ExWorks is meaningless. So let's have a place. Now, where should that place be? Well, it is fairly obvious. That should be your factory, your warehouse, your office block, wherever it is the goods are going to be, that you, the exporter, are going to be ready to hand the goods over. Wherever that is, that's your ExWorks named place. And it can be a factory, it can be anything. It doesn't matter if it's a warehouse, a factory, or anything else, name that place properly. And when you've done that, you've got to relate that named place to what ExWorks really means. And this is where we get a tie-up with people being very confused price lists. Because a lot of companies have an ExWorks price list. And yes, they do forget to say where ExWorks is, but they think they have an ExWorks price list, and they believe that the prices quoted on it just include making it, packing it, labeling it, and having it ready to ship at the end of whatever production line you possess. Now, that is true. That is what's built into a cost for ExWorks, because the only thing that the exporter is required to do under ExWorks is to produce some sort of invoice. Even if you're not selling it, you need a free of charge invoice or something like that, because we're talking international trade here. You need some form of invoice. And you've got to tell the buyer where the goods are, that they're ready. So it is your job to produce some sort of invoice and tell the buyer where you are and where the goods are. And that is it. Now that surely represents the minimal liability for an exporter. And on the face of it, perfectly true. No problem with that at all. If you've got an ExWorks price list, that's exactly what it means. Wrapped into the cost on the price list, you make it, you pack it, you label it, you do an invoice, and you tell somebody it's ready. That's all you've got to do. But now we need to look at that in the context of an international supply chain. Because what happens next? Well, next, somebody's got to pick it up and somebody's got to export it. That's why it's an international shipment. So what does that mean? Why does that not keep with the plan of the exporter not being liable? Well, the first problem we have is who's going to load it? When that vehicle comes to fetch the goods, if that's the way it's to be picked up, who's responsible for the risk in the loading process, the cost in the loading process, and organising, so responsibility for the loading process? Under ExWorks, it's not you, the exporter. You should stand there with this theoretical box outside your front door, or maybe your back door, and just stand and watch while the person who comes to collect picks it up and takes it away. And it's not your risk, it's not your liability, it's not your cost. Now that would be perfect if it's a small box and the driver comes along, picks it up off the pavement and puts it in the back of his van. He's working for the buyer at that point. That's easy. Not so easy if it needs pallet lifting, if it needs special loading gear, or if actually the normal practice at your place is for the vehicle to back up to the loading bay and your pallet truck puts it into the back of the vehicle. You're actually already breaking what ExWorks means if you do that as the exporter, because you're undertaking something that is not your responsibility. So who's legally liable for that? Well, under ExWorks, the buyer is. So have you asked the buyer if they mind if you use your pallet truck to load it? What if the goods fall off the pallet truck while they're trying to get them in a lorry? Who's going to take the liability for that? Your insurance or the buyers? Answer: the buyers. Not yours, not according to ExWorks. If you do that work, you're doing it on behalf of the buyer at their cost and their risk. Not built into your price of the goods and not against your insurance. Now, Incoterms 2020 accepts that in many cases, it's not really possible for the buyer to lift the goods onto the means of transport. It is in many cases, but not always. So what they recommend is if you're an exporter who wants to do that work, then you should obtain written permission from the buyer to do it at their risk and their cost. And if you've got that written permission, carry on and do it. If you haven't, don't do it. Because where does the liability go if something goes wrong in the loading process? So that's the very first step, still on your premises as the goods are picked up. And liability, the exporter doesn't necessarily realise they've got. What else happens next? Well, once the goods are on the back of some theoretical truck, then they are moving towards a port or an airport. They're going to be leaving the country somehow. Fine, it's quite clear that the cost of that transport is nothing to do with the exporter, not under ExWorks. So surely this is the end of it for the exporter. Goods gone, forget it. Well, alas not, because somebody has to get those goods through customs and out of the country. They won't be leaving unless they go through customs. Just like when you travel through an airport, you have to go through customs check and security first, or so do your goods. So who's going to make the declarations to customs? Well, under ExWorks, it's not the exporter. Wrong name then. You should be called the supplier, not the exporter. So let's change that to supplier. You are the supplier. Very well. Who is the exporter then? Who is going to take legal liability for the information given to customs? Well, it's not you, the supplier of the goods, not under ExWorks. So we must ask ourselves a second question: who is allowed to be an exporter? And this is the answer I'm going to give holds true for most countries, that the only people who are allowed to be exporters are companies who are registered as companies in the country of export. So we are looking around now for a UK company, a UK registered company, to be the legally liable person for export. Well, let's imagine a scenario. You're in Leeds. You've done ExWorks My Factory in Leeds, and the goods are on their way now through an airport, East Midlands Airport, leaving the country to a buyer that you have in Australia. That's your sale to Australia. So who is the exporter of the goods? It's not you in Leeds, not under ExWorks. Can your buyer in Australia be the exporter from the UK? No, they're a company registered in Australia. They can't be the exporter. Okay, who's left then? What about the freight agent they've employed to be the exporter? Can they do that? No, the clue's in their name. They're an agent. They're an agent of somebody. They're an agent of the exporter. So who are they the agent of? They're not usually going to take liability for being the exporter. They know nothing about the goods. They know nothing about the contract. How can they give all the information to customs in their own name? They can't really, and they don't want to have that liability. They wouldn't be an agent otherwise. They'd be the principal. So it's not going to be the freight agent. Now this leaves you with, of course, a black hole, because there isn't anyone in this scenario to be the exporter. And this is where all of the difficulty and the liability comes from. Because what actually happens in practice, and I'm not saying this is right at all, it isn't, but what actually happens is that freight agent or fast parcels carrier is acting on instructions from the people in Australia, from the importer. They're the one who are paying them, they've engaged them, they're acting on their instructions. And they will have told them who you are, you the supplier, because the freight agent's got to arrange to pick up the goods. You know, they need to know who you are and where you're coming from. They'll have a copy of the invoice you have prepared. So they've got your company details and things like that. And they will use those details and they will put you, the supplier, down as the legally liable exporter. Now, you won't be asked about this most of the time, it'll just happen. You have suddenly taken on the liabilities of an exporter, which are extensive, all to do with customs valuation, tariff codes, pricing, all sorts of things. So you don't even need to know who that freight agent is as the supplier, let alone have given them an instruction as to how your goods should be described, what tariff code should be used, what value should be placed upon them for customs purposes. You won't have done any of that because you didn't think you needed to under ExWorks, and indeed you shouldn't. So they will actually gather together what crumbs of information they have and make the export, but they'll do it in your name. You will never see the paperwork given to customs. You will never get a customs entry back into your company to check. But if customs want to come and audit the exporter or raise fines or penalties for wrong things, guess who they're going to come and visit? You, the supplier, because you have legally become the exporter. The only way you can avoid this is by selling the goods to a UK company. And that is why ExWorks is actually listed as a domestic term. Because if you sell the goods to a UK company, you truly can wash your hands of them at your back door, wherever that is. You can forget everything else. So that's why ExWorks causes a problem. So I'd like to open the floor now for some questions, if there are any.
Thank you, Susan. I haven't received any indications on chat, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to unmute everybody. And if you'd like to ask a question, please do. If everybody asks at once, I will invite one of you at a time, but I'm unmuting you all now. So does anybody have a question they would like to ask? That's right, I have now unmuted everybody. Please ask your questions. Does anybody have a question? No? No questions today?
Goodness me.
Actually, I'll ask one question if I may, please.
Certainly. Who is speaking, please?
It's Stuart. It's Stuart.
Hello, Stuart.
Hi, just one question from my side. Obviously, ExWorks, excuse me, not ideal for international trade. What's the closest to ExWork, but actually would be most appropriate for international trade? I think we've been looking at things like FCA. Is that a better transaction to use in this instance, or?
Yes, FCA is the closest you can get because FCA allows you to put FCA my place, my warehouse, my factory. So the same place as ExWorks, but FCA includes the supplier loading the goods, and FCA makes that supplier also the exporter of those goods. So someone's typing loudly. If you could mute if you're the typist. So that FCA is the closest you can get, but you are then knowingly taking on the responsibilities of being the exporter and all the legal liabilities. So you don't use FCA just as a swap out. You've got to understand the legal liabilities and risks you're taking on by swapping to FCA. But that is the one to use, undoubtedly.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, does anybody else have a question? No other questions?
Okay. Well, hopefully that has made things clear as to why ExWorks gets people into trouble internationally, because they do find that suddenly if there's a problem with loading, they are legally liable, and the buyer looks to them to fix it when actually they didn't expect to have to. And certainly the area of the customs entry and the declarations to customs on export are really legally difficult for a company. The risk, insurable risk, the legal liabilities and the costs and potential penalties, because just not having the export paperwork gets you penalties from customs if you're audited, because you're supposed to be, as the exporter, completely in control of everything. to do with that declaration to customs. And if you've not done that under ExWorks, but you get put down as the exporter, then you can quite clearly see customs are going to think you've been completely negligent, because you should have known about that all along. But in commercial practice, of course, often you know nothing about that. And this makes the big difficulty for everyone. It's the huge black hole in the international trade against ExWorks. It doesn't mean you can't have an ExWorks price list. You can, but you can't deliver ExWorks unless you're making a domestic sale. There's a difference there, you see, between putting up a price list that says this is the base minimum price of my goods, and then offering to do parts of the delivery in the supply chain by your choice of actions, and then hopefully matching your Incoterm to your actions in the full knowledge of the risk and legal liability that you are taking by doing such a thing. I hope that's made that clearer for everyone. Are there any more questions now?
Anybody got a question?
No, thank you.
No more questions, Susan. Thank you.
Okay. Well, there's not much else to say, except I hope you have learned something from this short webinar, and that we can see you on one of our other webinars in the future, which you can find on our website. Please register for those. The next Wednesday webinar today is all about commodity codes and tariff codes, but there are several others to come. So I hope to see you all again. Thank you for joining me.
We will be hoping to put the recording onto our website.